Welcome to Discovering Joy with Roy. I'm Roy Lawson, and today we're going to look at a two-time loser who wins big. His story is in the Gospel of Luke chapter 17. Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going to the village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And they went, and they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" And then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." Missionaries in East Africa taught me that when a thankful Maasai tribesman wishes to express gratitude, he says, "My head is in the dirt." The words derive from the Maasai custom of showing thanks by bowing low before another and pressing their head against the earth. For these Africans, the proper way to offer thanks is to humble yourself before your benefactor. That custom isn't far removed from the act of this grateful leper who Jesus has just cured. Actually, 10 men were afflicted by the dreaded disease, one of them a Samaritan. Amazed to see his fingers and toes restored and to sense feeling return to his numbed skin, praises God and falls on his face at Jesus' feet. "My head is in the dirt," he could have said, for it was. How can we grasp the complex emotions that must have been surging through this man? He's a leper. Lepers in Jesus' day were social outcasts. They were losers. They were considered unclean. We read of their pitiful condition in Leviticus 13, 14, 45 and 46. "Anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes. Let their hair be unkempt. Cover the lower part of their face and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean.' As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp." The rest of society had to be protected from this cluster of highly infectious diseases called leprosy. Not all the symptoms were chronic or fatal. Some so-called lepers recovered, and after a quarantine period were returned to normal life. Many, however, did not recover. Their futures were bleak. We don't know the precise form of the leprosy that had attacked the 10 men that Jesus healed. What we do know is that there were 10 men that nobody wanted around. They were dwelling in the no man's land along the border between mutually hostile provinces of Galilee and Samaria. Probably mostly Jews, but at least one was a Samaritan. And he would normally never be allowed to associate so freely with Jews who held themselves to be morally superior to the Samaritans. In Jesus' day, they eyed each other with the same contempt shown by some Israelis and Palestinians toward each other today. This Samaritan was, in a very real sense, a two-time loser. A leper, a member of the minority group, forced by his disease into the unwelcoming company of his traditional enemies, and those Jews would have nothing to do with him. So this man, this Samaritan, and this leper, he was a two-time loser. When one of them spotted Jesus walking toward them, he cried out, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." The word of Jesus' healing ministry had reached them, even in their isolation, and they dared to hope he would help them. Perhaps they had heard how in Galilee, at the end of what we now call the Sermon on the Mount, a leper had knelt before Jesus and said, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." And Jesus defied one of the strongest taboos of his people, he reached out and touched the man, who was cleansed immediately. So these men found courage in Jesus' reputation. They dared to ask for help also. He didn't touch them, though, or even go to them. He almost casually asserted his authority over their disease by sending them to a priest, as if they were already whole. Only the priests could pronounce them clean. Well, they immediately did what he told them. We tend to overlook this fact as we concentrate on the one leper who later returned to Jesus, but the truth is all 10 believed Jesus, and all 10 did precisely what he told them. If they had doubted or disobeyed, we'd have a different story. No, they obeyed, and they were healed. It is impossible not to see the similarities between the 9 non-returning lepers and dutiful, believing, obedient Christians who don't hesitate to do what the Lord wants them to do. No one can question their faith. They attend worship regularly, they give money, they even hold a job or two in the church. But something seems to be missing. They are dutiful, but not joyful. They accept their share of church work, but they plod through their routines with a heavy sense of ought to and little want to. Theirs is a Christianity of the minimum. They do what must be done, they obey to the letter, but they miss the additional blessing which these returning lepers, or which this returning leper receives. He's the big winner. Dr. Albert Schweitzer, famous missionary doctor of, well, now, many decades ago, commented on this incident, and he refused to charge the others, that is, the 9, with ingratitude. He believes all 10 were grateful, but first hurried home to greet friends and take care of their business. They intended to return to thank Jesus later, but the press of matters at home prevented their doing it until it was too late, and Jesus was put to death. I think Dr. Schweitzer was too kind. I may be overly cynical, but the proportions seem about right to me. 1 out of 10 said thanks. Very few persons live lives of genuine thankfulness, but those who do are the big winners. Years ago, I read Susan Atkins' disturbing autobiography, and it was titled Child of Satan, Child of God. Only you old-timers will recognize her name. She was a member of the Charles Manson family. She participated in those famous murders of actress Sharon Tate and Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. It was a huge scandal at the time. As a teenager, Susan had left her unhappy home and plunged into about every kind of personal sin imaginable: liquor, drugs, sex, robbery, murder. She was a bitter, foul-mouthed, frightened young woman. But in prison, this 2-time loser was led to Christ. Her new life was the reverse of everything she had known before. She found new purity of body and language, a new love for those she formerly hated, and a new beauty in her face and eyes. And most of all, a new attitude of life based on gratitude. She had, in effect, cried, "Jesus, have mercy on me." And he did. Malcolm Muggeridge, a famous British writer, a writer who wrote with poisoned pen, late in his life gave himself to Christ. Now this was a man who formerly could deftly describe every human fault and foible, and whose own diabolical cleverness made himself miserable. But after his conversion, he wrote a great deal about the enormous gratitude he felt now toward his Creator. He wrote, "I believe with a passionate, unshakable conviction that in all circumstances and at all times, life is a blessed gift." Christ saved him from himself. Gratitude became the dominant theme of his last years. Well, when I was teaching college, some of my students asked me to write out my testimony. It was the first time I'd ever been asked to do so. I surprised them, and I think maybe I surprised myself a little, when I titled my testimony, Confessions of a Happy Man. Now, I was teaching in the turbulent 60s. No self-respecting student would admit to being happy. The cares of the world weighed too heavily on that generation. But the truth is, I was happy. I called it happiness. I could have easily and perhaps more accurately called it gratitude. And that gratitude filled me with joy. I recommend writing such a testimony. You probably discovered, as I did, that there's much in your life to complain about. And undoubtedly your parents did not fully understand you, and they certainly made outrageous mistakes in raising you. Your schools were quite inferior. Your childhood was filled with legitimate and illegitimate fears. Since then, your boss has been a tyrant and neighbors uncooperative. The manager of your little league's team doesn't know as much about baseball as you do. Your finances are a mess. Your church is full of hypocrites. Your government is destroying the country. On top of all of that, the weather has just been terrible lately. True. All true. You certainly have no reason to be grateful. But what shall we say about these disturbingly joyful people who have been through as much difficulty as you, maybe even more, yet they're so exasperatingly contented? They agree with Mr. Muggeridge that life is a blessed gift, and they praise God in the same circumstances that drives others to curse God. Apparently, gratitude has very little to do with what happens to us, and very much to do with the person it happens to. 10 lepers were healed. One said thanks. Jesus was hoping for more. Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? Among the 20th century's tragic figures, one giant of a man towered above the others. Lyndon Johnson. When he was thrust so suddenly into the presidency by John Kennedy's assassination, he quickly signaled to a waiting America his desperate desire to succeed. He wanted to succeed as president of all the people. Even more than success, he wanted to be loved. So he operated in the White House as a benevolent dictator, taking all the people's problems on himself, dispensing programs and dollars to solve every human ill. Observers of his presidency were pained to see this eager man who so earnestly sought his people's love become so hated that during the last years in the White House, he could hardly leave it. How is it possible, he asked in his bewilderment, that people could be so ungrateful to me after I've given them so much? Well, the answer to the question lies deep in the corrupt human heart. How could 9 lepers, suddenly set free, how could they forget their liberator so quickly? Is the Russian novelist Dostoevsky right in his description of us? He says, I believe the best definition of man is the ungrateful biped, a 2-legged ingrate. Shakespeare had his King Lear lament, how sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. And there are many thankless children. And Shakespeare again in Twelfth Night put these words into Viola's mouth. I hate ingratitude more in a man than lying, vainness, babbling, drunkenness, or any taint of vice. While I'm name dropping, let me drop another one. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a very influential theologian in the last century, died in a Nazi prison just before the end of World War II. But he wrote of his status there, it's a queer feeling to be so utterly dependent on the help of others. But at least it teaches one to be grateful, a lesson I hope I shall never forget. In normal life, we hardly realize how much more we receive than we give. And life cannot be rich without such gratitude. That last line is why I'm claiming that the Samaritan, the two-time loser in this story, is the big winner. He has the capacity for a rich life. He receives an extra blessing from the Lord. He has said thanks. Thanks and praise, did you notice, are one? One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back praising God in a loud voice. And he threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. Praising, thanking. Jesus, accepting the man's thanks, laments that the others didn't show their gratitude. Other scriptures equate thanksgiving and God praising. Here's Psalm 106:1. Praise the Lord. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Praise, give thanks. The simple word of thanks that Jesus offers before breaking bread with his disciples on that Last Supper occasion. He combines gratitude for the food with praise to God for providing it. To praise is to give thanks. What we need is to allow George Herbert's famous prayer to become ours. Thou that hast given so much to me, give one thing more, a grateful heart. Not thankful when it pleases me, as if thy blessings had spare days, but such a heart whose pulse may be thy praise, whose very pulse may be thy praise. In these studies, we've been seeking to discover joy. And we found it in so many places, so many ways. This one is foolproof. In fact, somebody wrote a song about it. I've discovered the way of gladness. I've discovered the way of joy. I've discovered relief from sadness. It's a happiness without alloy. I've discovered the fount of blessing. I've discovered the living word. 'Twas the greatest of all discoveries when I found Jesus, my Lord. 10 lepers were healed. All got well, but one got even more. He went back, said thanks, and found Jesus his Lord. And in doing so, he discovered joy, real joy. I bid you joy.